Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Hello and welcome to you. My name's Andrew Lawton. This is episode 1 of Lawton Online, a podcast exclusively on TheRebel.media. And it is going to be a fantastic show up ahead. The great Mark Steyn, author, columnist, radio personality extraordinaire. I'm not talking about myself. Mark Steyn is the guy I'm describing. Will be joining me on the program later on, talking about a whole host of issues, but most of all, I think global warming, which, you know what, is such a necessary discussion to have, given this great global warming-infused winter we've been having, or I wish we've been having anyway. I'm going to be talking to Mark Steyn later on in the program, but before we get into the meat of the show here, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do differently here. You know, I have a radio show. I've done commentary and writing and analysis and journalism and all these sorts of things, but every time, and we've seen this in Canada, we saw this on Sun News Network, where I was a contributor for quite some time, every time someone challenges the status quo, the bureaucracy tries to shut it down. The censors try to shut it down. The CRTC, the CBSA, social media shaming, all of these different things that try to silence people. And I have always maintained that, much like the Rebel itself, I will be fearless. From when I told radical Imam Anjem Chowdhury to come and get me, to when I've thrown down with politicians, to when I've tried to find the story even when no one's talking, I try to be fearless. Now, I'm not saying that to toot my own horn. Don't get me wrong. I'm scared of lots of things, like, well, you know, clowns and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I think conservatism in Canada needs a voice. And that's why I'm so glad to have the opportunity to join TheRebel.media, to be here today to bring you Lawton Online, and whatever the future may hold, I guarantee you're going to love it. And please do stay tuned to the show and every week, and it'll be absolutely wonderful. Of course, because after all, what would modesty be without, well, yeah, forget it. Modesty's not going to factor into this show at all. I wanted to begin by talking about something that has, I think, united all of Canada. Or at least that's what it was supposed to do, and that is the Day of Pink. Now, if you didn't put it in your calendar this year, don't worry. I'll hold it against you, although you're probably a homophobe, transphobe, etc. But the Day of Pink happened last week, and this is supposed to be the big day of anti-bullying in Canada. The big day that we are all supposed to unite together and say, we will not bully people, we will not be homophobic, we will not be transphobic, we will not do any of these things. We will instead love each other, and we'll show this love by wearing a pink shirt. And you know, the inspiration behind the Day of Pink is, contrary to what some people might say, I think actually quite altruistic. It's quite positive. The inspiration behind the Day of Pink, or the International Day of Pink, because after all, this isn't just a Canadian thing. We've been, global pioneers in this, came from a high school student in Nova Scotia. Travis Price and David Shepard saw him being bullied at Central Kings Rural High School. And what they decided to do was, instead of allowing this friend of theirs to be bullied for wearing a pink shirt, what they would do would be to rally together, get everyone in the school to show up wearing a pink shirt, and the outcome would be a happy-go-lucky place. Everyone's happy, everyone sings Kumbaya, and unicorns and rainbows abound. And they did this. And I think this is an example of friends doing good things for other people. This is an example of someone doing a nice thing, attacking bullying at the source, which is when it's actually happening. Not through ribbon campaigns, not through hashtags, not through people cycling across the country to generate a discussion that basically people were already having. And this is where Day of Pink went off the rails. Because it moved from an event into an actual day of awareness. From an event, from something that happened on a day in history to an awareness campaign. It became a hashtag. And I'm going to get in a couple of moments to the huge hypocrisy that we saw specifically on this year's Day of Pink when Lorene Harper ultimately succumbed to the bullying. And I'm going to ask Mark Steyn about that a little bit later on in the program. But I have to talk about the broader issue here of bullying, because this is something that's near and dear to my heart, given that, well, for most of my life, I've been one of the quote-unquote victims. And it always bothers me, not only as an anti-bullying activist, which is essentially what I think every human being is. So if someone says or is introduced as being an anti-bullying activist, I really wouldn't put too much stock in it, because I don't think there's the pro-bullying activist coming out and saying, well, I actually support bullying. I support the right to push that kid into the locker. No, everyone's an anti-bullying activist. Let's be real. But as someone who is against bullying and would like to see it eradicated, I also can't deny, nor do I think anyone else, that bullying does in fact make people stronger. Now, that doesn't mean we should allow it to move forward simply because it's a tough love type of situation, and you know what doesn't kill them makes them stronger, and so on and so forth. But when the anti-bullying campaigners become the true bullies, which is exactly what's happened here, I think we as a society, we as reasonable people here, I say that assuming that no one from the NDP caucus is listening at the moment, but we as reasonable people here should be able to say, hey, let's address it at its root. And this is where I think for far too long, parents have been bucking their own responsibilities. Don't worry, I said bucking. Hey, who cares? The CRTC isn't listening to this, so I can say whatever I want. But let's assume for a moment here that parents are the ones that need to take the burden of responsibility. It's not teachers, it's not school administrators. For the love of all that is good, it's not someone who's making a hashtag or telling everyone else to wear a pink t-shirt. It's parents that need to tell their kids to stand up for themselves. Parents that need to not punish their kids for throwing the punch if they're being bullied. And this is, I think, something that has been so absent from a lot of the discussions. And look, I'm not the pro-violence advocate here, because everything has to have a name. Everyone has to be an activist of some kind, apparently. I'm not saying that we should have kids staging these big, giant brawls in the schoolyard. But I'm saying that telling everyone to show up and wear a pink shirt is not ending bullying, nor will it ever. And Mark Steyn wrote a great piece a couple of years ago called "Pink is Now the Color of Conformity." And this is exactly the phenomenon that we saw this year with Lorene Harper, Canada's first lady, if you will, when on a day about inclusivity and anti-bullying, the activists who are pushing this day were boycotting the event because Lorene Harper was part of it. Because, well, her husband is a big, scary, bigoted, racist, closeted homophobe, but whatever he is that day, that means that Lorene Harper can't partake in it. And it's laughable to me, if it weren't so shameful, that this hypocrisy is unchallenged and allowed to go on as though no one sees it. And Ben Shapiro wrote a great book about this, looking at bullies and who the real bullies are. And for all of the hashtag campaigns, for all of the awareness campaigns, for all of the people who are apparently telling us how mean we are and how we need to all be nicer. And remember when Barack Obama a couple of years ago said that the U.S. needs a new tone, none of this, mean, violent rhetoric. New tone is what we're really looking at this as. And Ben Shapiro looked at people like Dan Savage, one of the most crude and callous individuals around there. And I'm not just talking about how he calls out people like Rick Santorum and whatnot, but we're talking about these feel-good campaigns like It Gets Better that are participated in by people who resort to the phenomenon they are claiming or pretending to attack, which is bullying. And this is, I think, when you look at the left, something that is all too common. I'm all for free speech. As a matter of fact, that's one of the biggest constants that I feel we need to embrace and accept and encourage and fight for, freedom of speech. And I do not believe in free speech without consequences. I believe that you can say whatever you want, and I believe that someone else can fight back because you've said that. In a legal, rights-based setting, that is what I feel most of us should agree with, most of us should find is in the best interest of Canada and of any free society. You can say what you think, I can challenge you, I can combat it, I can call you out on it. But it seems as though the left is the one that has the monopoly on controlling that discussion. The left is the one who, without skipping a beat, seems to revel in shaming and bullying and enacting change by this de facto censorship. It's not this mousy dung censorship where someone shows up, the speech police roll up in a van and say, you cannot say that. No, it's far more dangerous, though. It's far more dangerous when you have a movement that is based not on advancing their own beliefs because they have the arguments to back it up, but advancing their own beliefs by silencing others. And a lot of these awareness campaigns have done exactly that. One of the issues on which I've spoken and written a great deal, and I've spoken at events across the country about this, I've gone on TV about this, is talking about mental illness. As a survivor of a suicide attempt, as someone who has lived with depression in the past, this is an area that I feel is important. But that does not mean that all of these mental illness awareness campaigns are doing anything. And the reason I say that is because I have seen people vilified for calling out a lot of the mental illness advocates. And I'm actually in a position where I'm allowed to do it because apparently you have to gain in some way an eligibility to attack certain things. Only certain people are allowed to talk about certain things. It's like, that old Seinfeld episode going back a decade now where Seinfeld was concerned that his dentist converted to Judaism just for the jokes. And the priest to whom he confessed this said, you're offended as a Jew. And he said, no, I'm offended as a comedian. He converted just for the jokes. And it's like me with a past suicide attempt here. Not that I did it just to get the jokes out of it, I can assure you. No, but I'm allowed to call out these things in a way that other people aren't. And I find that to be so despicable. And you see it with the abortion debate as a prime example. People who say, oh, you cannot have an opinion on this because you are a man. As a matter of fact, Justin Trudeau himself, leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, a man who wants to be prime minister of this country, has fallen into that trap as well by saying that abortion is not an issue that should be decided by old men. This is what he said. Now, I have to question, and not even getting into the abortion debate nor any specific debate here, where are we as a society where people are somehow disqualified from having an opinion based on the color of their skin, based on their sex, based on their gender, based on their life experiences? I think you can use any of those factors to gain a sense of context. If a black woman is talking about racism she's experienced, I think that's going to be something that we can take into consideration. If a gay person is talking about discrimination they've faced, I think that's something we can take into consideration. If a woman who has had an abortion, who has faced an unwanted pregnancy, is talking about her experience, I think we can definitely take that into consideration, but no one who doesn't fit into those groups should be denied the right to have an opinion on those things, nor anyone to have any opinion. And this is what's so scary here, is that the left has devolved to such a point, and I say devolved as though they were at one point evolved, which I'm not sure necessarily fits the bill. But they've devolved to a point where a debate cannot be decided based on who has the better arguments, based on who made the most sense, based on who did the best job at presenting their view. No. The debate's argued by who can be the last person standing when everyone else has been told they can no longer speak. And they do it through isms and phobias. You are an Islamophobe, you are a racist, you're a sexist, you're a transphobe, and so on and so forth. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying those monikers don't exist anymore. I'm not saying there aren't racists. I'm not saying there aren't Islamophobes. I'm not saying there aren't homophobes. I know all of these people exist, but the terms are used without meaning and without substance because they advance an agenda. More specifically, and I think more poignantly, they prevent an opposing agenda from being advanced. And it's like Kate McMillan, the blogger behind Small Dead Animals, once wrote, the opposite of diversity is university. And I think universities are ground zero for this phenomenon. Universities are among, historically, the most free-thinking places in the world, but now they fall victim to liberalism, the belief that you are so open-minded that your brains seem to have fallen out. Once places for free thought, now places where going against the grain is not only discouraged, but vilified. Where professors are denied tenure because they have a belief that is different from the so-called consensus. And you see it in global warming, which we'll be talking about later on in the program. You also see it in Quebec's language laws, another story we'll be discussing later on as well, as they pertain to a toy that a man in Quebec wanted to buy, but it couldn't because it just didn't speak French. And to go back to this day of pink, I'm not saying that all of the world's inequality and all of the problems of political correctness being embraced by the left come back to the day of pink. The day of pink is a symptom of this, not the actual cause itself. But anytime people fall victim to these movements for the wrong reasons, we need to understand how much of a disservice we're doing to the broader discussion, any discussion, as a matter of fact. Because the second you are defined by the color of your shirt is the second you cease to be an individual. And you know what? For all the Lady Gagas of the world who tell people you need to be who you are, embrace who you are, you're born this way, why does that seem to be so far from the actual case? Be who you are unless you want to be the guy that doesn't wear the pink shirt. And, you know, when I read about Day of Pink, which admittedly is not something I put in my calendar every year, like I mentioned earlier, I was reminded of a case, I think I discussed it on Sun News actually last year or 2 years ago. It was a boy in North Carolina who loved the program My Little Pony. Now, I'm not going to lie, one of my favorite shows. I've never seen it, but I'm sure it's wonderful. He loved My Little Pony. He wanted to bring his My Little Pony backpack to school, and the school eventually said no. He was getting bullied. The school thought it would be a disruption. They said, no, you got to keep this backpack at home. And I actually agreed with the school in principle, not because I thought they were right to deny him the ability to wear what he wanted. Because what they were doing was not tantamount to censorship. It was actually them trying to protect him. The real problem in that story, I think, were his parents who didn't say, hey, you know what, maybe this isn't in your best interest. And then you get into this side of, does he have the right to wear the backpack? Absolutely. Should he expect to wear it without people telling him that he looks like a fool? No. Because part of being yourself means that you have to be prepared to deal with the consequences of people who don't like you and people who don't like who you are, and maybe people who are very mean about it. And the problem is that we've moved so far towards bubble wrapping that we're denying our kids one of the greatest gifts they will ever utilize in their lives, which is that of resilience, which seems to be a non-existent quality these days. And I'm going to talk when we come back about something where I think this plays in so heavily to the discussion, which is this ongoing conversation in Maryland about free-range kids and whether or not kids should have the right to be independent, to walk to a park, to play in the park, to walk home from the park. I actually had the opportunity on my radio show to interview Lenore Skenazy about this very question. I'll play a couple of clips from that. when we return. This is Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. I'm Andrew Lawton. Stay with me.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media.
Thanks for staying tuned. As I promised, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about free-range kids. Now, this is not some organic hippie movement. This is not something you get at Whole Foods here. I mean, maybe they are. I don't know. I actually haven't looked at their menu in a while. But this is a new trend in parenting that is actually a return to the good old days, a return to the way parenting used to happen, which was basically to be not laissez-faire, but to be a bit more open to allowing your kids to be kids and allowing them to do it with a bit of independence. And it's been really unfortunate that so many cases in the last few months, in the last year in particular, have criminalized parents letting their kids be independent in some way. The most high profile of these is going on as we speak still, as a couple in Maryland are fighting Child Protective Services in their region for detaining their kids without food, without access to their parents for 6 hours. 6 hours last week. Because they were playing unsupervised in a park. Alexander and Danielle Meatviv have 2 kids. Rafi and Devora. Rafi's 10 years old. Devora is 6 years old. They were initially subject to a Child Protective Services investigation back in December when they had allowed their kids to walk home from a park a mile from the family's home. Again, last week it looked as though the same park was at question here when once again someone saw the kids walking alone, called the police. CPS still had a file open on the Meativs. Ended up detaining their children in a police car and in an area at the station. And now the parents are being made out to be some sort of poster parent couple for negligence, when in actuality they are adherents to free-range parenting, which is a name applied to something that I think to many people was simply a matter of common sense, which is using your discretion as a parent, making decisions that make sense for your child to allow your child to do relatively low-risk activities like playing at the park. And it's quite interesting to me that this has become such a source of controversy because a lot of people go to a place where they assume the worst. And this was something that I actually had a discussion on my radio show on AM 980 in London about a couple of days ago with Lenore Skenazy, an author. She writes for Reason. She is a columnist who became known as America's Worst Mom after writing about letting her 9-year-old son ride the subway in New York. And now she started a blog. She has a book out on free-range kids, and she's been following quite carefully the Meativ case. And I spoke with her, and I wanted to play a clip for you that I think speaks to one of the bigger challenges here and a couple of the other themes that are really at stake here of why all of these helicopter parents, but not only helicopter parents, helicopter neighbors, helicopter family friends, helicopter aunts and uncles who are trying to protect other people's children are actually doing their kids even more of a disservice.
And the current mania that drives me nuts is what I call worst first thinking, which is whenever you say, like, well, I'm going to let my kid walk to the park. What if they break their ankles? What if there's a predator over there? What if there's a Mack truck with brake problems and they're careening into the park? People congratulate themselves on coming up with the least likely, most fantastical, worst-case scenarios, and throwing them at you, and apparently you're supposed to consider yourself a bad parent if you haven't wondered, oh yeah, what if there are tarantulas? I hadn't thought about that. What if a lion escapes from the zoo? Really hadn't thought about that a whole lot. And so all I'm trying to do with free-range kids, free-range parenting, is say that parents are allowed to make decisions based on reality, based on their observations, based on the fact that actually the most dangerous thing you can do with a kid is put them in a car and drive them somewhere. That is the number one way kids in America die.
Wow.
And so if you're allowed to drive your kids someplace, you should certainly be allowed to let them walk outside, play, get some fresh air. It even improves their vision. So the idea of criminalizing loving, caring, old-fashioned parents is obviously crazy. And I'm trying to fight it with something I call the Free-Range Kids and Parents Bill of Rights, which is one sentence. Can I tell you what it is?
Yeah, absolutely.
It is, our children have the right to some unsupervised time, and we have the right to give it to them without getting arrested.
That was Lenore Skenazy. It just, to me, baffles me that needs to be codified as a standalone law. That you need to have a Bill of Rights for parents who want their kids to be independent, at least in some way. And we look at so many different other areas where these kids are just absolutely bubble wrapped. And I don't mean any specific kids in general. From playgrounds being taken away from schools at recess so the kids don't hurt themselves, to anti-bullying initiatives like we were discussing in the last segment of this program that do more to bubble wrap kids than actually protect them or allow them to protect themselves. And the case I referenced earlier was actually South Carolina, not North Carolina. I apologize to the North Carolinians that I accidentally tainted with this brush. There was a woman named Deborah Harrell, a McDonald's employee, a single mother, whose daughter, 9 years old, would play alone at a park when her mom was at work. Ms. Harrell would go to work. Her daughter would play with her laptop at McDonald's. They had free Wi-Fi. She'd go across the street to the park every now and then. It doesn't seem to be a great arrangement, but it's a woman with unfortunate circumstances making the best of those very circumstances. And at the park across the street, there were swings, a splash pad, there were trees, there were benches, there were things that the daughter was doing. And what happened was an adult went up to her, said, "Where's your mother?" The daughter said, "At work." Police were called and came and declared the girl abandoned. As though the mother didn't know where she was, as though the mother hadn't given her a phone to use in the case of emergency. And it's so fascinating to me because here's the ultimate hypocrisy and the ultimate irony of this. We say that we don't want kids to be alone. And the reason is we don't believe that it is safe for them because some stranger could come and abduct them. A stranger could give them a hard time. So we respond to this by strangers going up to the kids and asking them questions about their parents, calling the police, who then take the child. And I'm not saying that police or child protective services taking a child is tantamount to an abduction, but I will say that it is creating the very same scenario that it's pretending to protect these kids against, which is a disruption in otherwise safe and healthy playtime at a park. And people would respond to this and say, oh, but what about this? What about that? The fact is, as Lenore Skenazy has written about on numerous occasions, crime rates are going down. Crime rates are on the decline. So the "it's a different world" trope that I think people employ, it's not as safe to walk down the street now as it was when I was a kid, as it was back in the day. It's actually safer now. Crime rates are at the rate in the U.S. that they were in the 60s. So anyone who is a parent now can actually pretty safely say that it's safer for their child to walk around the street than it was for them, perhaps. And there have been so many examples of this, not just the Métis, not just Ms. Harrell, but examples of parents who are essentially robbed of their right to be parents, robbed of their autonomy over their children, robbed of their rights to exercise discretion. And this is what I think needs to be noted here as a right that needs to be preserved, which is the right for parents to employ and enact discretion over their children. And that doesn't mean that you have the unequivocal right to carte blanche, do whatever you want to your children. No, there are obviously rules. The actual threat of neglect obviously is something against which all children, all people who are vulnerable need to be protected. But why paint parents who are actually giving their children a leg up for the rest of their lives being painted as negligent and abandoning their children when in actuality it's the state who has really abandoned these kids by forcing their parents to be helicopters? It's the state that is saying, we think it's more important for you to be always under the watchful eye of a grown-up than train yourself to be independent. And look, there are some 10, 11, 12-year-olds that aren't as responsible as others. There are some 6, 7, or 8-year-olds who I think are more mature than other people their age, perhaps a bit older. As a matter of fact, I think there are some 6, 7, or 8-year-olds that are probably more mature than, 19, 20, 21-year-olds in some cases. So why is it? I have to ask, why is it that we're so afraid of letting parents take a step back? There is a fine line between negligence and free-range kids, according to some, but I don't see there as being that fine a line at all. I think they're very, very distinct and very, very unique from one another. I'm going to play another clip from Lenore here in just a moment. This is her talking about another facet of this very conversation.
I believe it's a scarier world, but it is not rationally scarier. We are more scared. We have been trained to be scared about everything. I told you about that worst first thinking. We're told to do that. My mom couldn't think of 10 kidnapped kids the way I can today before when I'm thinking of sending my kids out, because these are the stories that are just imprinted on our brains. But in terms of reality, in terms of statistics, both my country and your country are enjoying record low crime rates. And sometimes people think crime is down because we're keeping our kids inside. But crime is down against adults as well. Arson is down, burglary is down, assault is down, murder and rape are all down.
And like she said before, by the way, it's more dangerous to be driving around with your child, picking them up from school in your car, than it is to let them play at the park alone. And don't get me wrong, it's easy for me, someone who admittedly doesn't have kids, to say, oh, this is ridiculous, come on. I understand, I do. The desire for a parent to want to be protective of their kids, I do. But it's when as society and as a culture, we have not only tarnished the mentality that leads to free-range parenting, but actually criminalized it. I was actually quite impressed. There was a piece in the Globe and Mail responding to what's going on in Maryland a couple of days ago, and it actually quoted a number of people as to what should happen, what an adult should do if they see a kid playing alone in a park with no parents in sight. And I was quite pleased that a spokesperson for the Toronto Police Service, Jennifer Sadu, had said it wasn't a police matter unless the child was in distress, unless the clothes were disheveled, they looked hungry, they looked not cared for, they were crying, unless they were in danger of some kind, there's no matter for police there. It's completely fine for a child to be at a park. And someone else, Tracy Warren from the Injury Prevention and Education Department at Child Safe Canada, had said, why are you a stranger going up and speaking to kids in a park? If there's nothing happening and they're safe and playing, why intervene? Just allow them to play. So it seems as though we're starting to have a bit of sense in this. For now, anyway. Got to take a quick break here. When we come back, going to be talking about Quebec language laws and how they are imposing some nonsense that impacts everyone in this country by denying people basic rights. And later on in the podcast here on Lawton Online, going to be talking to the great Mark Steyn. Stay tuned on The Rebel. We'll be right back.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on TheRebel.media.
Have you ever read an article of some kind, a news story, you've heard a report, and the first and only thing that you can think at the end of it is, oh my goodness, I must have been reading The Onion. That must have been satire. There's no way that was possibly true. Unfortunately, I think the world has changed in such a way that I am inclined to believe that most of these things are true simply because so many, absurd and asinine things happen. Well, the latest came out of, no surprise, Quebec, where Toys R Us has decided to make a little girl cry, except it wasn't Toys R Us's fault at all. It was the Quebec language police. It's actually a story from CBC. Nick Messina, a father of a 1-year-old named Karina, wanted to purchase her a Daniel Tiger toy. Now, I must admit, before I read the story, I had no idea what Daniel Tiger was. I don't keep in touch with all of the childhood characters that are beloved to children today. I know a few of the ones that were around when I was a kid, but I wasn't familiar with Daniel Tiger, but apparently he's all the rage among 1-year-olds. And she had laid her eyes at a Toys R Us store on Daniel Tiger and a plush toy that speaks. So Nick wanted to give his daughter a great Easter present, wanted to buy it. He went up to the clerk and had at some time in the conversation or in the transaction mentioned that the toy only spoke English. Of all the 14 phrases that Mr. Tiger or Daniel, I'm not sure how he prefers to be addressed, of all the 14 sayings and songs that Mr. Tiger speaks, all of them are in English. When the clerk learned this, she said, "Oh, well, I cannot sell it to you. It is illegal for Toys R Us and any other retailer in Quebec to sell a toy that is unilingual unless it is unilingual French. The only way they can get away with selling the English one is if they had an all-French one available alongside it, which was not the case." And remember, this is the same province that has laws surrounding what words can be on private businesses' signs, as an example, and how large they are allowed to be. The English can't be more than 1/3 the size of the French, because heaven forbid someone might look up and say, oh, well, I guess because the English is bigger, I want to become an English person now. I'm going to become an Anglophile and an Anglophone. But Toys R Us couldn't sell the toy because it was unilingual. Now, there's a bit of a redemptive arc to this story, though. Toys R Us apologized. So I thought, great, they must have apologized and given him the toy. No. They apologized for having the toy on the shelf. They said it never should have been available on the shelf. They've taken it back and have shipped it to an Ontario store to sell. Persevering, Nick later went online. Decided he would order it from the Toys R Us website. Well, it was blocked from shipping to Quebec. The happy ending, if you will, lukewarm at best, however, is that he ended up buying it on Amazon, although he had to pay $50 more than Toys R Us was selling it for to get this thing. And I don't want to at all put the blame on this incident on Toys R Us. No, they're following these Orwellian laws that amount to state censorship. They're following the lead of the Quebec French language Gestapo, who enforces this language equality, which is really a fascistic inequality against English-speaking Quebecers, of which there are many, clearly, Nick Messina and his family of Montreal being among them. And I used to actually, believe it or not, visit Montreal quite a bit. My grandmother used to live there. And as a child, went up there on a regular basis. And it was always a different world. I mean, not being old enough to understand the language law implication of things. Not being old enough to understand the cultural significance. But also at the time when I was there as a child, it was always a place that had English much more well embraced. And much more widely spoken. And that culture doesn't really exist anymore. A lot of the English-speaking Quebecers have fled the province, and understandably so. And it's easy for people to look at this case and say, oh, well, that's Quebec. Let Quebec do what Quebec wants. But we can't really, as the ROC, the rest of Canada, do that without accepting one key quality here, which is that Quebec is an example of why the Constitution does not protect Canadians. Quebec is an example of why our rights can apparently be trampled on by a provincial government who doesn't like the language that we speak. Now, take out Quebec and its language infighting for a moment here. Forget about French and English here. Let's say that Daniel Tiger spoke Mandarin, or Daniel Tiger spoke Portuguese, or Daniel Tiger spoke German. Who really cares? If someone wants to buy it, let them. If someone doesn't want to buy it, let them find something else. Why does there need to be a law prohibiting sale of this? As though somehow that is going to uproot the balance of Anglo-Franco relations in the province of Quebec. Heaven forbid someone learn that there's a toy that speaks English. That could just change things just too much for this backwards province. And it's not like Quebec hasn't tried to suppress people's thought before. Look at the value of charters, or charter of values, rather, as a classic example of this. Going after religious people, not just Muslims, but Jews and Christians and any religious individual who worked in a public sphere, whether it was a school or a courthouse, was targeted. And we see something very similar here with English-speaking Quebecers, which is that it is acceptable not only for individuals to be bigoted against you, but for the government itself to deny your rights. And I don't have an issue, by the way. If Toys R Us wanted to say, you know what, we respect that this is a French language-speaking province, we're only going to sell French toys. As a business, they should have that right. But I vehemently object to any state-imposed effort that makes that a requirement. In the next segment of Lawton Online, Mark Steyn joins me. I'm Andrew Lawton. This is TheRebel.media. Stay with us.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on TheRebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Thanks for sticking with us. Joining me on the line is the first guest of the first episode of the first podcast of Lawton Online here on TheRebel.media, the great Mark Steyn, author, guest host for Rush Limbaugh, and all about wonderful Canadian expatriate. Mark, it's great to have you on the program and great to talk to you again. Welcome.
Hey, great to be with you, Andrew, and an honor to be your first guest. I'm hoping we can get the show canceled in the next 10 minutes.
Well, we don't have to deal with the CRTC on a podcast, so you might have to work extra hard for that.
Okay. Okay, I'll do my best.
We were just chatting before the tape was rolling here about the weather, and I know it's such a trivial and mundane conversation, but I think that the weather has become such a topic of love for the left here. And I know there was a story that came out in Canada just a couple of days ago. You had a bunch of climate change activists marching through the snow to protest global warming in April.
That's right. And it's always fun to do that. I remember a local radio station in my corner in New Hampshire a few years ago, some global warming group, during a mild December, had bought these ads saying, if you don't think global warming is real, look out the window. And that was a valid line to say in early December. By late January, February, March, April, it was colder than it had ever been, and they were still running these stupid ads because they booked them for 4 months or whatever. And we make jokes about this, and the snotty climatologists say, well, weather isn't the same thing as climate. Good heavens, just because every time Al Gore gives a speech there's 14 inches of snow, that's nothing to do with global warming. Well, climate, as defined by the World Meteorological Organization, a climate period is 30 years. We have now been 18 years without global warming. So we're only 12, in other words, any of your listeners who graduated from high school last summer, there's been no global warming since they were born. If they're just graduating from college, there's been no global warming since you were in kindergarten. If it goes on another 12 years, then it won't just be one of these ha-ha cold weather jokes. It will be actually a World Meteorological Organization established fact that we are in a 30-year cooling climate. And at that point, the global warming guys are really going to have their work cut out.
And this is actually very timely for you. You are part of a compilation of essays and writings, including a Londoner, someone from my city, Dr. Christopher Essex, about climate change, the facts. And it's a very bold title. And I think what I like the most about it is that we don't actually hear a lot of discussion about the actual facts of climate change. It's a lot of conjecture, a lot of nonsense. It's a lot of marketing and branding. So how important is it, or how significant is it that this book is coming out that's really going to show something that I would say a lot of people probably don't even know are even facts? I think a lot of people have just accepted that, oh, well, yes, global warming is happening. It's a bad thing. I don't like it. And this is because I've been told not to like it, and I've been told that it's a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think that accounts for a lot of the sort of soft support for the global warming side. I'm honored to be in this book. There's some of the world's most eminent scientists. There's fellows from the U.S., Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and it includes some of the most eminent scientists. And then there's fellows who are more there just for the cheap knockabout, like me. And a couple of others. Donna Laframboise, who is an old colleague of mine from the National Post days and is merciless on the IPCC, which is this international panel on climate change, headed by Rajendra Pachauri, who is not a climatologist, but is in fact a railroad engineer and a pornographic novelist. He wrote a fabulous book about a climate activist, a UN climate. He's a UN climate honcho, and he wrote a fabulous novel a couple of years ago about a UN climate activist who goes to climate conferences all around the world, nailing all the chicks he meets at this conference.
This is like the discount hotel pornography, I think. When you don't want to pay the full price, this is what you get.
The world's first warmographic novel, and I was hoping it's going to become a new genre, but sadly he's actually had to resign from the IPCC because he was getting a little too frisky with the girls at the office party. This is the kind of bizarre freak show that has been peddling this global warming on an international scale. And as you say, Christopher Essex from your neck of the woods, I think he's at the University of Western Ontario. He's in the book. I said it was eminent scientists and then those of us who do the cheap knockabout. He does a bit of both because he's hot on the science. But he has a parody of the What a Wonderful World It Could Be song. He don't know much about climatology. He has a parody of that song in there. So he does a bit of the knockabout and the serious science, but most of us know where our expertise lies, so I just do the cheap knockabout in the book.
Well, you mention a lot of the scientists in the book as well. You've mentioned some of the people who are like the IPCC chap, not really climatologists, but are accepted as being these eminent experts in this. And this is a lot like Canada's own hometown hero, David Suzuki. You know, obviously he's a scientist, he's well established in the world of biology, but he's presented as this climate expert, despite the fact that from a climate education perspective, he's really not more any well-versed than someone who has a PhD in basket weaving.
No, and in fact, Suzuki made a complete chump of himself on Australian television, I think it was last year, when he was revealed to know there's like 3 centers that are recognized as the world centers for measuring global temperature, and he'd never heard of them. And he's someone who, Suzuki is the kind of faux expert, the sort of ersatz expert who gets touted at taxpayer expense on the CBC, but he knows absolutely nothing about the subject. And I would be quite happy if he had the guts to do it, but he's not the kind who does. I'd be quite happy to debate him on the subject on national television. Not saying that I'm an expert, but I'm far more expert than he is. And when you talk to the experts on this subject, and they all go. When you listen to people like Michael Mann, the guy who invented this hockey stick, who's the big global warming hockey stick, who's currently suing me, and they're talking about the 97% consensus, there actually is no such thing. There are all kinds of distinguished experts, including Nobel Prize winners all over the world, who think this big climate alarmism is a complete crock, and they think it's a complete shakedown.
Including, interestingly enough, the founder of Greenpeace is one of those people.
Yeah, but you also you have. Well, I'll tell you one. Professor William Happer, who I particularly like on this, because he equates it to Orwell's Ministry of Information. And I think that's right. It's a way of actually terrorizing people. It's the ultimate scare story, that we're living on this fireball, and the slightest thing, just you going and buying a new SUV instead of some little electric car or a hybrid. Just you going and instead buying a Chevy Suburban, and the whole powder keg could blow. And this hysteria is a kind of Orwellian Ministry of Information kind of campaign, and it's completely unrelated to anything that's actually going on in the climate, in the observed temperatures. And I don't actually think it's going anywhere, because I think these guys, every year that goes by without any warming, these guys have a harder and harder time actually justifying the hysteria.
And I'm glad that there is actually a compiled sort of set of these details and works, not just from you, not just from Dr. Essex, from a bunch of different experts. People can get Climate Change, the Facts. Can people get that at the Steyn Online store?
Yeah, and I'm happy to autograph it for the global warming hysteric in your family.
Now, does that
rightful and thoughtful gift?
Does that increase or decrease the value?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I'd probably there's some fairly glamorous figures in there, like Nigel Lawson, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer in Mrs. Thatcher's ministry and saved the British economy. I should probably fake his signature. What I love about the climate guys is they always, if you've ever done anything in another field, that is always cited as evidence of how you're unqualified to speak about climate. So they say the fact that Nigel Lawson saved the British economy immediately disqualifies him from saying anything about climate. And it's like, it's like if you're a violinist, you can't comment on whether that cello concerto is any good. And this is complete nonsense. I mean, the people who most dislike all this global warming mobbing hysteria are in fact statisticians, because like that hockey stick graph is basically a statistical exercise. It's not about people going out and collecting tree rings or whatever. But after being sued for 3 years, Andrew, what I love about this subject is the way the global warming hysterics, the people who've fallen for this line, are mainly like Hollywood elites. So like James Cameron, the great Canadian film director who made that Avatar and Titanic, he did this unwatchable TV series with Jessica Alba running around in a tree ring bikini saving the planet. Actually, I may have fantasized about that scene, but let it go. And he had all his Hollywood pals in it, and still no one was interested in it. It's a boutique issue for upscale billionaires feeling guilty about their private jets and their Malibu jetting from their Malibu mansion to their place in the Rockies. And as a kind of penance for it, they want to make everybody else take the bus, give up their washing machine, and beat all their laundry dry on the rocks down by the river with the native women every morning. I mean, it's basically an elite boutique hysteria, I think.
Yeah, and even in Ontario, where cap and trade has just been put on the table by our Premier Kathleen Wynne, the Ontario Minister of the Environment was recently renamed the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change.
Right. I think, and that's true in a lot of countries. I think in Her Majesty's government in London, they actually have a Secretary of State for Climate Change. And I have absolutely no idea what that guy does all day to justify a ministerial salary. It's ridiculous. I
wanted to ask you very quickly before we go here, Mark, what were you wearing last week for the Day of Pink?
I wear pink a lot. You've seen me on stage, and I'm a notoriously camp and effete fellow, and I often wear pink shirts. Normally when I'm on stage, one thinks of the famous episode of The Simpsons where Homer actually accidentally throws his shirt in the wash and it comes out pink, and he worries that he's not confident enough to pull off a pink shirt at work. And they wind up sending him off for psychiatric testing. And the poor guy winds up in a straitjacket, and it requires some effort. I forget how that episode ends, but I'm not like that. I confidently wear a pink shirt most of the year, particularly when I'm on stage, on television, a lot of other things. But I won't wear a pink shirt on the International Day of Pink, which was last week in Canada. I gather it's international, but I don't know when it is in Yemen, when it is in Somalia, when it is in Saudi Arabia. But there's something creepy and totalitarian, even if it's in a supposed good cause of bullying, in coercing everybody to wear these same... We now are in a culture in North America where you can't have school uniforms or anything like that, but you can make everybody wear the same pink thing. What would it be like? I mean, if you or I were still at grade school, it actually takes some guts to say, screw you telling me what I'm going to wear. I'm going to wear a blue shirt today. I'm going to wear a green shirt today. I'm going to wear a cerise shirt. Oh, no, that's a bit too pink. I'm going to wear a chartreuse shirt today. Just to stand up for what is really we're losing in this soft totalitarian society, which is the right to intellectual diversity. The only diversity that matters. Diversity of orientation, diversity of all that is piffle if you don't have intellectual diversity and proud, free individuals able to choose the shirt color they wear at school.
Well, and this is where we saw the abject hypocrisy, and this actually ties in with the climate change discussion of how much people seem to flock to intellectual conformity, but on the pink shirt side of things, we saw how hypocritically Lorraine Harper, wife of the Prime Minister, was bullied for her participation in an anti-bullying day.
Yeah, and I think that's always... I like Lorraine Harper, actually, and I've seen her in pink. One time she was gracious enough to entertain me at Sussex Drive. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to talk about this, but I don't particularly mind. And I thought I was going to get like a slap-up steak dinner, and she just ordered in pizza. So I was mildly disappointed by that. But she was actually wearing a pink suit, and she looked absolutely lovely and radiant in it. I happen to disagree with her on this. I don't think in what is already an unpleasantly coercive exercise that the Prime Minister's wife should be lending the imprimatur of the state to it. I would be deeply disturbed if the Governor-General, for example, were to be an official patron of the Day of Pink. I just don't think that's appropriate. But, people can disagree about that. I think she's a smart, intelligent, funny, charming, delightful person whom I agree with on most things, and if I don't agree with her on this, it's not a big deal. But it was fascinating to see the way the LGBTQ QWERTY activists jumped all over her. And some of them were boycotting the Day of Pink because she had been appointed an official ambassador for the Day of Pink. And I think that teaches an important lesson to conservatives, that you can, no matter how much ground you concede to the leftist enforcers, it will never be enough. Those guys demand 100%. It's not enough to say, oh, I don't believe homosexuality should be criminalized, because then they'll say, well, we want you to be on board with gay weddings. So then you say, okay, I think gays should be allowed to marry. And then they'll say, well, no, you've also got to be on board with transgendered bathrooms. And you say, oh, okay, we can have transgendered bathrooms. And then it'll be something else. The goalposts are always moving. And you think you can, people always think this will be the last concession, and it's never enough. These guys are serious about the society they want to build, and they want 100% conformity. And you yourself know about this, Andrew, that you can be big-hearted and generous, and be tolerant of gays and all the rest of it, and no matter what it is, just one little misstep, one little refusal to buy the whole 100% program. It's a set menu. You can't order a la carte. And that's why what happened to Mrs. Harper is actually, quite a useful lesson, I think, in what happens when you think you can meet people. They don't want to be met 80% of the way. It's 100% or bust. No
pick and play, as you mentioned.
That's right. It's not the salad bar at Denny's where you can have a bit of this and a bit of that. They're going to shovel it all down your throat, and you got to swallow it all.
Well, we are out of time for this segment. Mark Steyn, always a pleasure. People can go on over to steynonline.com and check out Climate Change the Facts. Order a copy that is autographed. I know I can't wait to get my hands on mine. Mark Steyn, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Really appreciate your time today.
Hey, great to be with you, and congratulations on the new show, Andrew.
More of Lawton Online coming up in just a couple of moments. Stay with us here on TheRebel.media.
It's time for It Must Be a Liberal, only on Lawton Online. Scouring every corner of the globe for stories so outrageous, there must be a liberal involved.
Yes, as you just heard, it is time for It Must Be a Liberal here on Lawton Online on TheRebel.media. Scouring every corner of the globe from Toronto to Timbuktu, from California to Cambodia, from Mississauga to Mozambique. Can you tell I failed geography? Finding the stories so outrageous, there must have been a liberal involved. And to kick off this weekly feature here on the podcast, we actually have one from here in Canada, or Gatineau, Quebec, which is, I suppose, close enough to Canada. It is about a man who decided he would stage a robbery and commit theft at the Talbot Denture Clinic in Gatineau. There was one staff member there. They left for lunch at 1 p.m. When they returned, they saw there were holes in the wall leading into the clinic. The door had not been forced, but a laptop was missing, and also a $5 bill, which had been left in a donation box on the counter, was missing. But there was something there that was not there when the staffer at the clinic had left, and that was a dachshund, better known as a wiener dog. It was the pet of the 31-year-old thief who not only decided he would bring his dog to the robbery, but also decided to leave him there. And oh yes, the dog had ID around his collar, which had the home address of the man who was in possession of both the missing laptop and the $5 bill stolen from the donation counter. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail for breach of probation and break and enter, but I think that is nowhere near the level of shame he is subject to today for being so ridiculously inept at even something as simple as stealing a laptop without leaving your pet dog there, that it's safe to say he must be a liberal. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the first episode of Lawton Online on TheRebel.media, and I'm Andrew Lawton, looking forward to chatting with you next week. Thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out TheRebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.